Welcome to NOAA Live Alaska. My name is Lisa Hiruki-Raring, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This series is a collaborative effort by NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center, where I work, NOAA's Alaska Regional Collaboration Network, and NOAA's National Weather Service. This is the 9th webinar in a series that we designed to help you get to know NOAA's work in Alaska and how we connect and work with your communities. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, studies the ocean and the atmosphere and where the two meet, from weather to ocean to the animals that live around us. All of our speakers work for some part of NOAA or work in partnership with NOAA. We hope this gives you a sneak peek at different career paths that you might be interested in. Today, we're introducing you to some of our partners, Lauren Devine and Veronica Padula from the Aleut Community of St. Paul Island Tribal Government on St. Paul Island. And this is in the Pribilof Islands in Alaska. If you might remember from last week's webinar, Katie Sweeney gave us a little sneak peek of what it looked like on the Pribilof Islands, so we'll explore that a little bit more today. NOAA works in partnership with the tribal governments and communities of St. Paul and St. George in the Pribilof Islands on research management and education projects. While we'll be talking about NOAA and its partners' role in science and research and stewardship, we want to recognize that we're all coming to you from the traditional lands of Native communities who have substantial traditional and local knowledge and much to share with us. We acknowledge that Lauren and Veronica's work is on St. Paul Island, and we'd like to acknowledge the Anunga of Pribilof Islands, of St. Paul and St. George Islands for stewarding their lands and waters. We would also like to acknowledge that Lauren and Veronica are presenting from Anchorage, the traditional land of the Dena'ina, and we're hosting this webinar from the traditional lands of the First People of Seattle, the Duwamish people past and present. A few guidelines before I hand you over to our speakers. You're all muted because we've got a lot of people on the line and we want to make sure everyone can hear our speaker. However, there's a box that you can write questions and we encourage you to ask them as we go, and I'll be keeping track with my colleague Chris Beyer for Lauren and Veronica. They'll stop every now and again and answer a few questions, and we may not get to all of our questions, but we'll answer as many as we can. All right, I'll turn it over to Lauren and Veronica to introduce themselves. Oh, you guys are muted still, I think.
I am muted, you're correct, thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Veronica Padula. I am the Academic Program Director for the Aleut Community of St. Paul Island Tribal Government. I've been working for the tribe for about almost 4 years now. I'm doing lots of cool research activities and education activities with youth. Just a little bit about myself. I'm originally from New Jersey. I have been in Alaska for over 10 years. I really got into studying animals and wildlife in college. So, you know, the love happens almost any time in life. And I've been obsessed ever since, mostly with seabirds, but I love all things. And I continue to do work on seabirds and marine debris for graduate school, and other things beyond that include work around fish and all other creatures. So I'll hand it over to Lauren from here.
And there we go.
Good morning and good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We have to say a huge thank you to NOAA Live for letting us spend this time with you today. My name is Lauren Devine, and I'm a wildlife and marine biologist. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, and I've always loved the ocean and being near the beach, just being outside in nature. That's always something that has been something that's been a part of me. I grew up berry picking and riding my bike through the woods near our house, and that naturally led me to kind of want to do something in natural science when I graduated high school. And I thought, I love animals and maybe I could be a veterinarian. And so when I went to college, that was my plan. But I learned shortly after going to college that you could study wildlife as a degree. And so I thought, that's definitely what I want to focus on. I don't want to be a vet. And so I studied wildlife and fisheries. I learned how to scuba dive, and I started doing research in Georgia and Florida doing underwater scuba diving. And so when I graduated, I loved that. I was ready to explore some different things, and I heard about salmon management in the Pacific Northwest in Alaska and thought that might be something I'd like to do. So I moved to Alaska over 10 years ago, and I went to the University of Alaska Fairbanks to study marine biology. And so I didn't end up working with salmon. I worked with snow crabs, but that was pretty exciting. And I ended up interning and doing an internship with the tribal government on St. Paul because I wanted to learn how an Alaska Native tribe managed their natural resources. And I went to work for the tribal government on St. Paul in the Pribilofs, and I've been there ever since. So I get to work with a lot of different animals. We manage a reindeer herd. We work with our commercial fishermen and work with snow crabs, red king crab, and different fish species. We also work with marine mammals like sea lions and fur seals that you learned about in another NOAA Live seminar. And one of my favorite parts is that we get to bring youth into the field, into the laboratory, and involve them in research. And I also get to go into the classroom on St. Paul and in some Alaska area schools and teach about different Alaska animals and the research that we do, like we're going to talk about today, but also getting to learn from youth that are in the state and know so much about Alaska wildlife. And so today we're going to share with you just a few of the examples of how we get to work with youth on the Pribilof Islands. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started.
All right.
So we should be on the title slide. Today we're going to share with you just some of the projects that we involve youth with in wildlife monitoring on the Pribilof Islands of Alaska. And the joy of working on St. Paul really is that we have about 65 youth from kindergarten through 12th grade in high school. They're all in one building on St. Paul. And that is a few enough people that we really get to know each one of our youth personally. We get to work with our students one-on-one or in groups that in a larger area just wouldn't be possible. And so we're able to go out to the field or the beaches, cliffs safely, and explore the island with youth on St. Paul. And we also get to work with teachers in the classroom more often than I think a lot of larger school districts get to. And we get to bring science and math and art. We get to run around in the gym and play basketball and volleyball with the kids. So we do both formal and informal education all the time with our youth on St. Paul. We also get to help them pursue opportunities like traveling to Seattle for the NOAA summer science camps. And so we're just going to share a few things. Before we do, if you go to the next slide, let's see, where are we? Where exactly are the Pribilof Islands? We just wanted to make sure everyone knows when we say St. Paul or the Pribilofs what we're talking about. So the Pribilof Islands are located in the Bering Sea. They're those two tiny little specks in the red circle on the map. You can see I've indicated where we are, Veronica and I, in Anchorage, Alaska. And we are about 700 miles out in the Bering Sea for the Pribilof Islands off of mainland Alaska. The two islands of St. Paul in the North Island and St. George, the southern island of the two Pribilof Islands, are volcanic. They are surrounded by ocean, obviously, being islands. And this is really an area where weather is kind of created for the Bering Sea and the North Pacific. And so we get lots of crazy weather. We get high winds, high waves, snowstorms that can blow you off of your feet. In the summertime, oftentimes we get fog that is heavy enough to cancel flights. So we might go for a long time without being able to come to or leave the island because of the thick fog. And the islands used to be part of the Bering Land Bridge. So in the image that you see where the light blue shows the kind of shallow ocean, that all used to be land above the ocean sea level between US and Russia. And so we were just at the southern end of the Bering Land Bridge, but it was all connected between Russia and Alaska. And in fact, Unanga, as we'll talk about later, are actually descendants and relatives of Russians from the Aleutian chain and peninsula on Chukotka. So next slide. Here is a little idea of what St. Paul looks like. Oh, are we going to the next slide?
Yeah, I'm just, there's a little bit of a delay.
Okay,
Sorry.
no worries. Well, I was trying to think about how to relate the size of St. Paul to something that would be familiar to an audience that is coming from different parts of the US and Alaska. And I realized maybe this isn't totally familiar to everyone that's joining us today, but I grew up going to Disney World, and I was delighted to find that when I was looking at, what is relatable to an island size of about 30 square miles, it's actually about the size of Disney World. So you can walk the entire way around the island of St. Paul in one day, although you definitely would need to bring lunch and snacks, but it can be walked. You can walk all the way around the island in one day. It's that small. We have about 450 full-time residents. We have one community grocery store, but when I say grocery store, I mean also the place that you would get furniture, hunting and fishing supplies, kind of hardware, all of the things that you would get at a variety of stores in a more urban area. It's all contained within just our one community store on island. We have a fish processing plant where commercial fisheries deliver red king crab, snow crab, and halibut, and they're processed on island. We don't have any restaurants. Everything is available at the grocery store. Every meal is home cooked. So kids and adults go home every day, Monday through Friday, from 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock, and eat lunch at home. So we don't serve lunch in the schools. Everybody gets to close down the office, close down the school at lunchtime, and we go home for lunch. And that's kind of an interesting difference for a lot of other places. Getting to come home as a family every day in the afternoon is pretty nice. The two buildings that I want to point out in the picture on the left of your screen that you can see some of town is the NOAA laboratory facility that we have on St. Paul. And it's the big white building there in the right bottom image. And that is where we do a lot of our laboratory work, as well as when NOAA visiting researchers come out to the island, that is where they stay and bunk and cook their food and store all of their field equipment and lab equipment. And that's where they will do any lab work as well. And then I also wanted to show you guys my house. It's in the picture as well. It's on the left side of your screen, and it is the second house up from the bottom of the screen. So it's a little brown natural wood home right there behind my neighbor who recently repainted his house peach for a little bit of color. And so those are the two things that I really wanted to show you. The picture on the right side of your screen is really a typical view from St. Paul. So we have over a dozen volcanic cones or peaks dotting the island. And this is really typical in your view line. You can see one or more of the peaks of the island if you're looking inland. And then of course you can see the ocean almost anywhere that you look around the island, because we're such a small island and we're surrounded by beautiful Bering Sea. So we can go to, let's show the video. We have a little drone video, just a snippet for you to give you an idea of what it looks like from the air in St. Paul. So if you were to be flying in to come visit us on the island.
Hold on, I'm just getting it started.
No
just
worries.
now.
It is worth the wait.
Yep. Oh, hold on. Need to get over here. All right, and Lauren, you might need to remember to unmute yourself. So this
Absolutely
is
beautiful. Sorry. So this is a view from the island. You can see the peaks that I talk about in the distance and up close. You can see the shoreline as you reach the coastline, and this is looking northward from the island and shows you just kind of the field environment that we work in.
all right.
So go to the next slide. Yep. And so the community is quite active in subsistence living, and that includes hunting marine mammals like fur seals and sea lions, as well as reindeer, and fishing for crabs, halibut, octopus, cod, and other fish. gathering crowberries, also known as mossberries. And we have a little bit of cloudberries that grow on the island, but those are the only berries that we have out in the Pribilofs. And gathering intertidal foods like urchins, mussels, and limpets. The dominant faith on St. Paul is Russian Orthodox, or sometimes called American Orthodox. And we still celebrate some really cool holiday traditions. One of my favorite is coming up. It's called starring, which is kind of like caroling, where you go around from house to house in groups, and one person carries a big lighted star that they spin around while everyone sings songs in Russian. And then each household that you go to sing, all of the carolers are offered snacks and Russian tea from the households that they sing at. And so it's a beautiful tradition. Sports are also huge on St. Paul. So basketball is popular for all ages. Community basketball games are quite regular, and softball is really popular during the summertime. We usually have at least one volleyball tournament in the year, typically in the fall, when we have a lot of visiting researchers on island to participate. We also have a traditional dance group that performs around the state and also a lot on island for special events or at conferences. And the community is very good at coming together around big community potlucks, and we love to have dances where a live band plays. Next slide. So as we mentioned earlier, most of the residents are on St. Paul and St. George are Unangan, or Alaska Native, also known as Aleut in English. And on this slide, we've included pictures of the people we enjoy working with the most, which are the youth on St. Paul. You can see all of the fun that we have in the faces of these youth in these pictures. And really, youth help us conduct research about the Pribilof environment. They teach us about worldviews, and their values really keep us on our toes. There's just this amazing love of learning and sense of curiosity that we can't help but really, get excited about. And so all of this is really rooted in the Unangan values. And we've included a poster of Unangan values here. And I know you can't read the text, but we want to share with you a few of the values because we think they're really excellent values for anyone to live by. And some of those include that life is gifted to you, and what you make of it is your gift in return. To live with and respect the land, sea, and all nature. To always learn and maintain balance. And that subsistence is sustenance for life. And a copy of this values poster is available on the resources page of the NOAA Live Alaska site if you're interested in reading more about the values or reading all of the values on the page. Let's go to the next slide. The Pribilofs are often called the Galapagos of the North because of the diversity of wildlife and plants there. And I've shown you just some of the diversity here. And I've already mentioned some things like our reindeer herd, stellar sea lions, and fur seals earlier, but we're going to talk more in depth about some of these animals today. So next slide, before we dive in, I wanted to stop and ask if there are any general questions that we can talk about or answer before we dive into specific projects.
Okay, I just had also wanted to say that we have a couple of your friends on the line. We have Susan Smith from Takotna, who wanted to say hi to both you and Veronica, and also Molly Fox-Zaleski from Facebook. So if any of our if any of our other viewers would like to, or any of our viewers would like to type in questions that they might have for Lauren about St. Paul Island, or the things that she was talking about their life, and Randall is also calling in from Kiana, Alaska. One of the things that we were wondering about actually was when you were talking about St. Paul and saying that there was no freshwater source, how do you get fresh water for people on the island to drink while you're there?
That is a great question. So first I'll say Ong Ong Kilamechena to Susan and to Molly. Good morning. And that's a great question. We don't have any freshwater streams, rivers, lakes on the island. Any kind of lake that we do have, which we do have a couple, are connected to the ocean enough that they're brackish, or they have some level of salt in the water. And so we don't have any freshwater bodies. The way that we get fresh water on the islands is through an aquifer. So the islands actually both have underground aquifers that have fresh water that collects from snow snowfall and from precipitation on the islands. Because they are volcanic, the soils are very porous, meaning that the water from snow or rain, when it settles onto the ground, it really doesn't stay on the ground very long. It sinks through all of those layers of volcanic soils and it collects into a gigantic underwater lake. And it's vast enough and it recharges, or it fills back up with precipitation at a rate that allows the community to be able to dig a well into the aquifer and tap that fresh water and pump it out to everybody that lives in the community.
Great. That's really interesting. I never really thought about underwater fresh water that you can use. So that's
And
great.
it's really interesting because if you think about it, there's a big underwater freshwater lake that's sitting underneath the ocean, which is, you know, a saltwater body. And so it's really a fascinating and unique kind of situation. One thing that we have been discussing as a community is we think about climate change, how it changes weather, and the amount of rainfall and snowfall that our island is receiving every year. It changes how quickly that aquifer and that underwater lake fills up, and it changes the level of that water. And so we have to be very careful and monitor and make sure that that level of water isn't changing as maybe we receive less snow or less rain in a given year, that we would have to worry about or think about different ways to get fresh water to our island. So that's something that our community is thinking about.
Wow, that's really interesting. So Randall from Kiana was noticing that the kids in his class were that the values that you were talking about for the Anunga community were roughly the same as the Inupiaq values that they live by, and so they were really interested in noting that.
That is correct, and I did want to mention that. I think that all of our Indigenous communities in Alaska, there are so many different Indigenous cultures here, but a lot of these values are, when you really look into them, there are a lot of similarities and commonalities, and that is something that is so beautiful about Indigenous cultures, is that the ways that govern how you live and how you interact with your environment, at the heart of them are very similar, and they're just very beautiful, simple words to live by.
Great. And then Cole and Samantha from Jacksonville, Florida, had wanted to know what is school like for the kids on St. Paul? Do they get to study puffins?
Oh, great question. We're going to talk about that. I might hold that question for Veronica in our SEABIRDS section.
Okay. And you didn't mention that everybody at school goes home for lunch, so that's a little bit of a difference. But and we'll talk a little bit more about how kids get involved in research. So maybe at this point we can go on and talk about your next section here, and I'll go.
Sure. And I will say, just generally, classroom sizes are much smaller. Teachers have multiple grades, and so we have fewer teachers and a pretty small school, pretty close-knit school system on St. Paul. So those are some of the differences. So let's dive in to northern fur seals. Our first species we're going to focus on are LAAQUDAN, or northern fur seal in English. And again, you may remember Katie Sweeney talked about northern fur seals last week on NOAA Live. The northern fur seals are marine mammals, meaning they spend most of their lives out in the ocean swimming and feeding on a variety of fish and squid, and they come to shore on the Pribilofs to have their young. They come back to the Pribilof Islands each summer to have pups, and in fact, the majority of the world's population of fur seals spend their summers on St. Paul Island. Seals return in April to May each year, and females arrive a little bit later in June, and then pups are born in July. Mom fur seals nurse their young and take trips to sea to get more food, to make more milk for their pups. So they go out and forage for fish and come back and feed their young. And those trips can take anywhere from 2 to 3 days that they leave their pups on island to go swim and find food, to up to 9 to 10 days to get enough to be able to come back and nurse their pups again. So pups are born in the summer. They're not able to swim when they're born. So they spend their time on the rocky shorelines of St. Paul, and the moms come back and nurse them periodically. but they do learn to swim within a few months of being born. So by the fall time, around October, they are starting to waddle towards the shorelines and play in the waves. They're amazing to watch, just kind of surf the waves. And by November, pretty much all of the seals on St. Paul have swum away, and they're overwintering in the North Pacific before they return to the Pribilof the next year. So the seals are really the reason that the Pribilof Islands are inhabited today. The reason why we have communities on St. Paul and St. George. The Pribilofs were settled by Russians that harvested fur seals for their pelts or their furs, and they sold those furs all around the world to make a large profit over time. And so that is why the islands were inhabited in the first place. Today, northern fur seals are an important food source for our tribal members, and they're harvested only when these seals are on land. So during the time that seals are breeding and having their pups, there's a lot of young males that aren't yet breeding that come to the island to learn how to hold territories, or to learn how to breed with females. And it's during that time that we can handle and work with the animals. And typically what we're working with are these young males. So we don't really disturb females and pups, but we work a lot with the males. And so things that we can do are looking to see if seals get entangled in marine debris. We help run a subsistence harvest where tribal members can take and butcher seals for food for their family. And it's during this time that youth are really critical to help us make those subsistence harvests happen. And they also help us to sample and collect information from those fur seals so that we can do the research that we need to on them. If you go to the next slide. We take a lot of data and samples from fur seals that are harvested for subsistence use, and we definitely put the youth to work all the time. The top left picture is actually us in the field. I'm the person all the way over on the left. I'm just taking data, and really everyone else is hard at work getting down in there. So some of the things that we do, students really help at every step of the harvest. We have to round up the animals. We have to kind of watch the animals, make sure they're not getting stressed or overheated. They're covered in a thick fur and they have blubber, so they're easy to get too hot when they're moving around on land. And so we really watch them, and the students know what to look for to make sure that no animals are getting too stressed. And then students really get hands-on in collecting tissue samples. We collect blood and blubber, liver and muscle tissue. And students even explore, like cut open the stomachs to see what seals have been eating. And lots of students learn how to butcher the seal for taking meat back to their families and to provide it to elders in the community. Everyone's taught to respect the animals and appreciate that the Pribilof Islands are the seals' home as well. And so we take care of the island, we take care of the seals, and the seals in return provide for families on the island. So St. Paul youth very much are protectors of fur seals for future generations. Next slide. And so, our youth really are the experts in fur seal biology and ecology. And part of the reason is not only because they're just living and learning with the seals on island as they grow up, but because we have so many educators that share what they're studying with fur seals with students. And students get a lot of opportunities to be part of that hands-on research for fur seals. So many of our youth's favorite memories have to do with fur seals, whether that's remembering getting to participate in a harvest or helping with a research project. They are always eager to learn about fur seals and willing to teach others what they know. So we have several educational events every year, and this really keeps the connection between students and fur seals alive and well. And every year we have a summer camp where students, again, are participating in those subsistence harvests. We might have them collect length measurements or tissue samples. Every fall, we bring scientists in to go into the classroom or take students into the field and laboratory to involve them in the kind of after the field work side of things. And so one really awesome resource I want to mention is a curriculum called LAAQUDAN, the Northern Fur Seal Curriculum, that's available on the resources page for NOAA Live. It has awesome lessons that were created from the Pribilof Islands fur seal herd, and it's been used in our classroom for years, but also the lessons have been used in all kinds of faraway places to teach youth science and math using fur seals as a focal species. So I will pause here for any questions about LAAQUDAN or northern fur seals before we move on to seabirds.
Okay, so we have a question from Michelle about what parts of the seals do the people eat?
The parts of the seal that people eat, the most common parts are muscle tissues. So the seal has front flippers and hind flippers, and the big muscles that are at the front of the fur seal are very nutritious, and they're very large muscle groups. And so that provides a lot of meat for families. There is also the liver and the heart and kidneys are consumed. And some people like to make what is called braided seal meat, where you take the entire intestinal tract of the animal and you clean it out and you soak it, and then you braid that with other parts of the muscle tissues into a really beautiful braid that you bake, and then you get the intestines and the meat together. The seal oil is rendered from blubber, so you can shave off the blubber of the animal under the skin before you get to the muscles, and then you basically put it in a jar and put it in a dark, coolish room, and you let it sit there for a little while, and it turns into liquid, and then you can pour it out and actually dip meat into it. Sometimes it's called stinky seal oil for obvious reasons. And then one of the delicacies of fur seal is the flipper. And so the flipper is cut, and then when you have enough, you put them into a 5-gallon bucket and you fill that bucket with salt. And then again, you put it in a dark, cool room and you leave it for a few months, and that flipper starts to ferment and it preserves in the salt. Think of like a piece of bacon or like a pepperoni type situation, only a very different taste than bacon or pepperoni. And so that delicacy of the flipper, once you pull it out, you cook it, and then you eat it with gravy over rice or in a stew. And the flipper is called lusta when it is fermented, and that is something that is a delicacy.
Wow, that's cool. We have a couple of other questions about, so let's see. Eve had asked, how do you choose which seals to harvest? And I think you had mentioned before that about the timing of the harvest, that you're looking at young males. So how do you choose which ones to harvest?
That is a great question as well. We are harvesting young males. So we have rocky shorelines and we have sandy beaches on St. Paul. And the rocky shorelines are where the pups are born. It's a safer environment, and that's where the females tend to go to have their pups. And the young non-breeding males get kind of pushed out onto the beaches. And so they hang out all summer in a different kind of environment or area of the habitat, shoreline habitat, than the females and the breeding males and the pups. And so what we can do is take people and go round up, or kind of, make a circle around the seals, and those seals are mostly males, young males. So those are smaller individuals. And when we herd them up, what we do is we have people that are trained, and they're just trained by experience. So at some point, you become a person who learns how to round up and harvest fur seals. And so it's a team effort, and individuals get together and then they guide small, maybe we'll round up, let's say 50 seals, and then 6 or 8 at a time will be kind of shepherded off from that, kind of guided off with using different types of equipment that we have, like kind of like a club or a big long wooden stick, so you don't get too close to the fur seals, and you can kind of guide seals away from the larger group. And then really individuals are looking at every single one of those seals. They're using their experience to determine if the face and the teeth look like a male or a female, and we only take males. And if that seal is small enough, we're looking for small seals. We have elderly people that are out harvesting, young children that are out harvesting, and so you can't have too big of a seal. So really what we're looking for are just the individuals that are a small enough size, that are male, and that look very healthy. So if a seal is entangled, we don't harvest that seal. We actually take the entanglement, we restrain the seal safely, and we get the entangled debris off of the seal, and then we release that. So we're not going to harvest that kind of animal. We're looking for a very particular set of characteristics in the types of seals that are harvested.
Great. We have a couple of other questions. I know that we need to get to Veronica's section, so maybe we'll just take one more question before we move on. We had a question about Randall's class was asking how many seals are there that come in the summertime?
Great question.
That come back to the island.
So on St. Paul Island, we have about 400 to 500,000 seals. That is a lot of seals. They are ever present on the island, and sometimes you might see one walking down the road, lost a little bit. There's so many seals. But we have about 400 to 500,000 seals on St. Paul. On St. George, they have about 50,000 seals. So significantly less, but that is still a lot of seals. And part of that is because they just don't have as much rocky shoreline area. It's a lot more cliff habitat that Veronica will tell you about with seabirds. And so it's great for seabirds, but it's not great for seal habitat. So we have a lot more rocky shoreline that you can see this female and pup in the picture here are hanging out along the rocks. We have a lot more of that kind of habitat. So we have hundreds of thousands of seals. It is a lot, and there's anywhere from like 40 to 70,000 pups born every year. Not all of those survive. It's a hard life as a fur seal, but that gives you an idea of kind of the numbers that I'm talking about.
Okay, well, maybe we should move ahead since we're about halfway through our time here, and we will switch to talking about seabirds. What do you think?
Take it away, Veronica.
Awesome. Share my webcam. Okay, here I am. Great. All right. Hi, everyone again. So I'm going to get to talk about some of my favorite animals, seabirds. Seabirds are a special group of birds. They spend their lives flying around the ocean until it's time for them to have their babies. And that's when they come to land and they build their nests and they lay their eggs. So lots of seabirds call St. Paul Island home, and I just wanted to go through like some examples of some of the birds that we get to see every summer on St. Paul. So in the pictures, starting from the top left, those birds are called parakeet auklets. And then next to them, we have red-faced cormorant. And then going around the circle, we have common and thick-billed murres, red and black-legged kittiwakes, which in this picture, the red-legged kittiwake is giving us a bit of attitude. I love them. There's a tufted puffin in the bottom left picture, and horned puffins are in the center. So someone was asking about puffins, and we'll talk a little bit more about them soon. And then finally, a northern fulmar. So the Bering Sea, where St. Paul is located, is a really important part of the world for seabirds. And not only because so many of them feed and nest there, but because they're extremely important to the people that live in those regions. So next slide, please. So we've been talking about the Unangan culture, and seabirds are important in the Unangan culture in many ways. The birds and their eggs are important subsistence resources. For example, people on St. Paul will scale these huge cliffs to collect murre eggs. And you can see in the picture in the background that pretty blue with the speckling. That's what a murre egg looks like up close and personal. They're very pretty. They're also really big and they're nutritious and yummy. I know from experience. Of course, they have special methods for collecting the eggs. So people collect eggs as early as possible to allow the murres to relay an egg and still hatch a healthy chick. And they never take more eggs than they need. So they leave behind lots of eggs so that chicks can hatch and be part of future populations of seabirds. Seabirds also help the people of St. Paul track seasonal environmental changes in the marine ecosystem. So the time that the seabirds return to island is a signal to the community of changing seasons and indicates that summer is around the corner. And finally, seabirds make many appearances in Unangan stories and traditions, and there are even dances about seabirds. So I included a picture of our dance group from St. Paul Island, and then some really beautiful Unangan-inspired art of seabirds in here. Next slide, please. All right, to the science. So scientists who study seabirds call them environmental sentinels. It means that by studying these species, we can better understand what's happening in the Bering Sea ecosystem overall. It's especially true when we're looking at seabird productivity, or how many eggs they're laying and how many chicks are hatching, and their population size, so numbers of birds overall. In years when lots of seabirds come to St. Paul and successfully lay eggs and hatch healthy chicks, we know the birds are healthy. And by extension, we can get a good idea that the Bering Sea ecosystem is overall in a healthy condition. In years when there are fewer seabirds coming to St. Paul and they cannot lay eggs and hatch healthy chicks, this can indicate to us that something is wrong with the ecosystem. So the seabirds on St. Paul Island have had some rough years lately, with low population counts and low productivity. In response, scientists have been conducting lots of research projects. We don't know the exact cause for their declines, so we have to ask lots of questions about why it's happening. Luckily, scientists have had lots of help from the kids on St. Paul Island to get the work done. They've helped me, in my personal experience, they've helped me dissect seabirds. So we've been really interested in finding out whether or not birds are ingesting pieces of plastic while they're at sea. And the kids have been helping me look inside their stomachs to see if there's any plastic in there. It's kind of a little gross, but they really don't seem to care. And they're very helpful in finding little pieces of plastic inside those birds' stomachs. Next slide, please. And then another fun project that they've helped me with is capturing least auklets, these tiny, cute little seabirds. We have needed feather and blood samples from least auklets for various projects to understand better what they're eating when they're at sea and where they're going. And so we analyze those samples for certain chemical markers that help us better understand those things. So there's one site on St. Paul called Zappanee, or Zap, and lots of least auklets build their nests in the crevices of the boulders there. They fly really low over the rocks, and so we can catch them by using these nets called mist nets. And we call them mist nets because they're so light and they sort of, you know how water in the air, misty water in the air can be really like hard to see? That's kind of what these mist nets are. And so when the birds are flying around, they kind of buzz right into the net because they can't see it. So when the birds get caught, the kids who've helped me with this project, they gently remove the birds from the net and hold them for me or for other scientists while we took measurements and we took samples. And I included a couple of pictures from these adventures. You can see them helping me set up the net in the bottom picture. And then in the top pictures, you can see one kid taking the bird out of the net. And then my other friend Chauncey holding the bird to remove some feathers from its breasts. And then I included just a picture of the little birds hopping off their boulders because they are really darn cute. Next slide, please.
Okay.
And then when it comes to seabirds, the work and the learning never ends. St. Paul Island youth and its seabirds are deeply connected, not only through the research that we do, but through education and citizen science activities. So I wanted to give a big shout out to two other groups that we work with and help in a large way to educate youth on island, Seabird Youth Network being the first. So every summer, youth gather for Seabird Camp, which is run by Seabird Youth Network. And truly, for me, it's like one of the most fun weeks in the year. Seabird scientists, teachers, and artists share their love and knowledge of seabirds with the youth. And then youth do all sorts of fun seabird-related activities. And at the end of the week, they perform a seabird-themed play for the community. It's really cute and it's really fun. One year, we had youth from Russia visit the island during Seabird Camp, and they were able to share their knowledge, traditions, and language with everybody. And so in return, we're hoping that we can do another exchange maybe in 2022, where some of the St. Paul Island students can visit everybody in Russia as well and learn from their community. And I would be really jealous of those kids that get to go. Next slide, please. And then the other citizen science group that we work with is COAST. So COAST stands for the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team. And this is a project that monitors the number of dead seabirds along shorelines all along the west coast of North America. This is really important work because sometimes we have seabird die-offs, which are specific events where large numbers of dead birds are found on shorelines all at once. Just like studying the birds when they're alive and breeding on land, we study these dead birds to get a better indication of the health of the Bering Sea ecosystem. And so if anybody who is watching this right now lives along the West Coast, you guys can also get involved in COAST and become citizen scientists as well. And those resources are linked on the NOAA Live page. So next slide. All right, that will wrap up our seabird section, and I can take any questions if anybody has any.
So if anybody has any questions for Veronica about seabirds, one of the questions that I have always been curious about is how do you make those fantastic not puppets, but like costumes that the kids wear for their seabird camp plays? Because I can see here that these kids have helmets on.
Yes. Yeah. So that's definitely not me. That is one of our partners. His name is Ram Papish, and he is an incredible artist and scientist. He's been going out to St. Paul since probably the early 90s, first as a seabird tech and then as an artist who has helped Seabird Camp become what it is. And he has created many, many cool helmets over the years. They are mostly paper mache and wire framing, sitting on top of bicycle and climbing helmets, and kid-sized, mostly bicycle and climbing helmets, because I've tried to wear some of them and they don't fit on my head. But they've been used in parades. They have been used in other teaching activities. They sit in the library at the school, high atop the bookshelves on display until we need them. Because they're paper mache, sometimes taking them outside, a couple have been a little roughed up by the rain and the wind, but you know, Ram's always game to update our helmets and make more.
So we have a couple of questions, so I'll just take two more questions because I know you have some stuff to talk about marine debris. Texas had wanted to know, how do you count the birds? And then I have one more question after that.
How do you count the birds? It's not easy. There are a couple of ways that birds get counted depending on what your goals are. So if you want to do an overall population count of the birds along the cliffs, sometimes scientists will take like small rafts out into the water and basically run the raft along the shoreline where the birds are nesting and count all the birds they see of a specific species. So often you'll have like 2 or 3 people in the boat, and one person will be counting cormorants, and one person will be counting murres, and one person will be counting kittiwakes. The other way that birds are monitored on St. Paul Island is that they have specific plots, or what they're called. And so a plot is just like a very specific section on the cliff that is counted over and over again in terms of counting how many birds are there. And the scientists will revisit that site again and again and again throughout the summer to have an average number of the birds over time. On top of that, when they go to those sites, when they go to those plots, they're also looking to see if eggs are being laid and chicks are being hatched. Hence why they have to be there all summer, because you know it takes time for an egg to incubate and a chick to hatch. One other way that birds might get counted in terms of like over a very long period of time, for example, when we catch birds and we have a bird in hand, we put a band on them. We put a band on their leg, and that band is a very specific, unique identifier of that bird. And you can go back to a site again and again, year after year, to look for those bands. So you can actually get a sense of how long some birds are living. Hopefully that covered.
Great. Yeah, and I think actually we should probably keep moving because we have about a little more than 10 minutes left. So, and then we'll handle any other questions at the end. So,
absolutely.
Okay.
All right. So our last topic is marine debris, or the human-made garbage that ends up in the ocean, which is not a pretty thing to say. So for any of you that have visited the ocean, you may have walked along the beach and found garbage in the sand, or you may see litter in your own neighborhoods. All that garbage, especially the stuff that litter in your neighborhood, it can end up in the ocean. And because the ocean's a really big place, it can transport that garbage across the planet. And perhaps I'm stating the obvious, but garbage in the ocean isn't a good thing. Not only is it gross to think about, but marine debris can also harm wildlife like turtles, seals, birds, and all sorts of other animals. And so on St. Paul, if you can remember that map, St. Paul's surrounded by the Bering Sea, water on all sides. The currents transport lots of marine debris to the island's shorelines, and a lot of it comes from very far away places. And we've tried really hard to do something about that. So next slide, please. And so, like Lauren had said earlier, the beaches on St. Paul, which I just said, can potentially get covered in marine debris, they're also home to the northern fur seals in the summer. And so no one wants the seals to return to a home covered in trash, right? For generations, the St. Paul community has worked hard to clear the beaches of debris just before they expect seals to arrive, making sure their homes are welcoming and cozy. Long ago, people were just clearing out things like driftwood, but as more trash has entered the ocean, the job of cleaning the beaches has become much harder. And people have to work to remove giant fishing nets and buoys and plastic containers from the beaches. So as a community, St. Paul's done lots of major marine debris cleanups over the past 2 decades. And sometimes in one session, they can remove as much as 21,000 pounds of debris from a beach. And that's not even going around the entire island. So just imagine how much debris that can actually start piling up on the shorelines of St. Paul. It's a lot of hard work, but totally worth it if it means that we're protecting the ecosystem and the animals. Next slide, please. And so St. Paul Island youth have always been involved in many marine debris cleanups over the years and have taken lots of garbage off the beach near their school. I had a momentary lapse in my brain power the other day because I could not remember the name of the beach that is by the school, but I was reminded, Gorbach Beach, that has essentially become sort of the adopted beach of the St. Paul Island School. It's easily walkable. We can spend about a half hour to an hour and get lots of debris off the shoreline. And we know that it is a spot where the seals come and hang out in the summer. So there's a lot of satisfaction in knowing that we've cleaned up the beach for the seals. The kids are really passionate about keeping their island clean, and even over time, they've formed garbage clubs. They clean up litter around town. If there is an act of community service that's needed, often kids will go toward litter cleanups and make signs about protecting the animals. So it's really a part of their everyday life to protect their island. Next slide. Thanks. And they've also been really active in getting the message out that marine debris is not good for the environment. They've done lots of cool art projects. And you can see in the lower right picture our marine debris seal, who is made out of many nets and buoys. And other sorts of projects, including a marine debris art mural that was installed in the school. They used lots of garbage that they collected from their homes and turned it into a beautiful under the sea theme, which I really appreciate. And they continue to consider what different things that they can do in order to get the word out about the harm that marine debris can cause. So with that said, if we could go to the next slide, please.
So Veronica, I was wondering if you wanted to show the video of the beach cleanup before the next slide, or?
Thank you for the reminder. And yeah, let's do that.
Okay. And so we should be loading it up just now. And then I just wanted to remind you, Veronica, to unmute yourself once.
So this is the cleanup that we worked on in 2019, which feels like a million years ago. But you can see everybody working really hard to clear the marine debris from the beach. It's definitely a team effort. And by the end of the day, everybody's very, very tired, but they always come back the next day to continue all the hard work.
I think one of the things that struck me, Veronica, from watching this video is how big the beach is, and just imagining how much debris you have to clean up.
Yep, and the distance you have to take it to get it actually off the beach.
Yes.
Which you can see now that they're going in the four-wheeler, taking it to the truck that's going to haul it away.
Yeah, and what we didn't show you is once it gets up on the grass, there's quite a ways to go still before the four-wheeler gets to the truck in order
Yep.
to take it away.
And that net that's behind the four-wheeler is very heavy. And probably not even nearly as heavy as the one giant net that the Coast Guard actually helped cut up and take away from the beach because we didn't have the tools to get it out.
Okay. Great. Okay, so I will go to the next slide then. If I can find my cursor here. There we go.
All right, so this is the last slide that I have for marine debris. We, discussed how we clean the beach of debris, how we get the word out, and sort of the next step in our evolution of how we tackle marine debris is prevention. And so in 2021, we're going to be working with the students to help get the word out about the harm that plastic packing bands can cause, especially when they get wrapped around the seal's necks. You can see in this picture of the seal, he or she has something really tight around their neck. And this one's very obvious, but sometimes a packing band around a seal's neck can be really hard to catch, especially in a giant, group of seals. So a seal could potentially be in pain from a packing band around its neck for quite some time before we see it. But the purpose of our project is to get the word out that, if you do receive any packaging with packing bands around them, to cut them before you throw them away, and then potentially, hopefully, in my very optimistic view, move away from plastic as a packing band material and potentially find better, more biodegradable materials that we can use in the future. But it's just an indication that St. Paul youth are always working to make a difference in the world and protect their island.
Okay.
I made it. Not 12 o'clock yet.
So for those, so we had a couple of questions that were left over from the last session. We have a few more, like 4 or 5 more minutes. If people have questions about the marine debris topics that Veronica had covered, please type in your questions. We did have a question about what baby puffins are called from Pascal.
Well,
Are they called puffins?
I call them chicks. They might be pufflets, but I'd have to Google that. I actually wouldn't know off the top of my head.
Yes. So if you guys are curious about what baby puffins are called, go look it up on Google and see whether you can figure that out. Because I've actually heard them called pufflings or pufflets, and I don't know what the official version is. Macarius had also wanted to know if there are people who know and use bird calls on St. Paul, or whether you do different, whether you use bird calls or whether you just go and find the birds where they're nesting.
So when it comes to seabirds, they're all in really obvious places on St. Paul. They all nest along the cliffs, and so it's really easy to access, especially in the context of, if we were talking about harvesting mer eggs, they're out in the open. Those cliffs are right there, and you can walk up to the edge and look over and see the birds. Just be careful you don't fall off. When it comes to things like puffins nest in burrows, but again, they're on St. Paul, they're nesting in the burrows that are kind of like within the cliff base. So you can see where the birds are because they'll come out, they have to go forage and find food. And so they'll come out of those burrows and fly off. So you kind of get a good sense of where they are. Same for kittiwakes and cormorants. Birds that I think would be difficult to find potentially would be things like ducks, but we don't have a lot of ducks necessarily nesting on island. They actually come and overwinter on island. So those would be a little bit more difficult to find if they are nesting. But when they're on the water, they're pretty easy to spot as well. Hopefully that answers. The only
and hunters
that are kind of like hiding. Sorry?
Oh yeah, I was going to add to that and say when our hunters are hunting for ducks, they do use bird calls, and our sea lion hunters use sea lion calls to call in the sea lions when they're hunting, but we don't use calls for research.
Thanks, Lauren. You could put your camera on too, Lauren, so that everybody can see you, because actually in the last minute that we did have a seal question. So I wanted to ask you one of the one. So Megan, actually it was Liam, I think, had wanted to know, what do the students usually find in the seal's stomach? Because you had talked about how the kids look in the seal's stomachs. And last week with Katie, we were talking about how researchers look in seal poop in order to look for hard parts that come from them.
Yeah.
So we were wondering, what do the kids find in the seal's stomachs?
So what's really interesting is that when male fur seals come to the Pribilof Islands for the summertime, they are practicing, or if they are breeding, they're actively holding territories, which means that they come to the island, they stake out a piece of the beach or the rocky shoreline, and they defend it with other males. So they are fighting all the time. That means if they leave their spot and they go to get food, they would lose their territory. So as young males are starting to learn how to hold territories, they, even if they're on the beaches, also do not ever really go to sea. And so they're not feeding. So whatever the fur seals come onto the island with is what's in their stomach. So that means that oftentimes when we harvest a seal and open the stomach, we're not seeing really anything at all. It can be completely empty. But sometimes we do see some different fish parts, a lot of the same things that you would see in the scat or the seal poop that you would identify, like squid beaks. They look like little beaks. And those parts are oftentimes, we find those in stomachs, and we see lots of like fish vertebrae and different spines and parts of fish. And then sometimes we just get a whole mushy ball of fish or or different parts. And sometimes we'll see, like a hard part from a fish or an invertebrate species, but that's mostly what we see in seal stomachs. And unfortunately, you got to get through a lot of seal stomachs to get to something really interesting, because a lot of them are just empty.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And so one last question, because we're coming to the end of our time. From Facebook, Eric Shelton was wondering, where do the materials get taken off of once they're off the beach for the marine debris? Are they sorted and some go towards recycling? And do some get barged to other places? They were wondering how that gets off island.
Mostly barged at the moment. Recycling is a really difficult thing to tackle on St. Paul. And we are thinking about better ways to tackle waste, but at the moment, the marine debris gets barged. We have partnered with a group called Net Your Problem to potentially get at least our line, our big, thick fishing line, to a recycling facility that repurposes the plastic into plastic pellets. Is that right, Lauren? It's like plastic resin pellets. Hopefully we can do that. We actually, because of COVID, we haven't been able to barge 2019's debris off island. They're all sitting in these like giant white super sacks in the landfill to eventually get barged. But hopefully we will be able to get some of that net to Net Your Problem for recycling. One of the other things that I've been thinking about is just like some small scale sort of work that we can do for recycling. We ordered this machine called a protocycler, and basically what it does, it shreds plastic and melts it and turns it into 3D printing thread. And so it's not a big thing, but it's something that the kids can work on to create 3D art projects with recycled plastic. So small scale, but something.
We also offer buoys that we pull off the islands as marine debris to our fishermen to reuse when they go out and set their longline gear for halibut fishing. And we do have a lot of partners that we have established in Seattle, where our debris is barged to, where it can get picked up, and we organize everything as different types of plastics. So all of the plastics, like plastic bottles and household type goods, can go to a recycling center in the lower 48, and it's not sent to landfill. But some things, that don't have recycling opportunities in Seattle end up unfortunately going to the landfill there.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your programs and all of the research that you're doing on St. Paul. We're really excited to see how you involve kids in your research programs, and we've gotten so many questions. I will send you guys all these questions as well. Thank you for
Wonderful.
being part of our webinar series, and yes, thank you all.
Thank you
Thank
for letting us go a few minutes over.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in and hanging in with us. We did go a little bit over, but we are going to be taking a 3-week break at this point. So we will come back in January. I think it's going to be on January the 12th with our next webinar, which will coincidentally be on marine debris. So we'll be able to follow up on the things that you've talked about, Veronica.
Cool.
And thank you everybody for calling in, and hope you have a very good holiday season.
Yes, happy
Bye,
holidays, everybody.
everyone. Thank you. Happy holidays.